Charles Higgins slipped the gold band onto Lily Thornton's finger, while Maeve Jenkins stood near the heavy velvet curtains of the ballroom. She watched his long fingers, the same hands that had held hers in the garden 3 weeks ago, slide the diamond into place without a single glance in her direction. The crowd of 300 people erupted into applause, their voices filling the large mansion in the heart of Charleston. Maeve placed her untouched wine glass on a passing silver tray, turned her back on the celebration, and walked toward the exit doors. She did not allow her shoulders to drop, and she did not look back even when she heard Richard Higgins release a loud laugh of satisfaction. It took exactly 3 seconds for her to realize that her 2 years with Charles had been a carefully constructed play. The heavy air of the July night hit her the moment she stepped past the grand portico of the estate. Charleston in the summer was thick with the scent of tidal mud harbor salt and the promise of rain before the arrival of morning. She walked down the stone steps past the rows of polished carriages and coachmen who paid no attention to a single woman leaving the party early. She had dismissed her own driver hours ago because Charles had promised to escort her back to her small house on King Street. The memory of his easy promise made her throat tighten, but she refused to let the feeling slow her steps. She moved past the iron gates and onto the open pavement, her slippers clicking against the stones as she put distance between herself and the orchestra music. She was 3 blocks away from the Higgins estate when she noticed the man waiting near the iron railing of an empty townhouse. He did not move as she approached, standing with a stillness that felt entirely unusual in the heavy summer heat. As she passed under the dim light of a street lamp, the man moved deliberately, lifting his black hat from his head. Maeve stopped short, her breath catching as the light caught his features. His hair was entirely white, falling in clean lines around a face that was equally pale, like carved white stone. Despite his striking appearance, his clothes were plain black cloth, free of any wealth markers or family crests. He looked at her with gray eyes that seemed to catch every bit of the ambient light from the street. "You have an advantage over me, sir," Maeve said, keeping her voice steady, despite the strange chill that seemed to radiate from his direction. The white-haired man held his hat at his side and did not take a step toward her, respecting the distance between them. "Gideon Cross," he replied, speaking with a low, calm voice that lacked any desire to impress or intimidate. "We have not been formally introduced, though I sat at the far end of the table during the shipping dinner 6 weeks ago." Maeve studied his pale face, remembering the quiet observer who had spoken to no one but watched the entire room. "What do you want from me tonight, Mr. Cross?" she asked, adjusting her light cloak against the sudden damp breeze. "I am here to offer you a ride in my carriage, because the storm will be heavy when it arrives," Gideon said plainly. Maeve looked up at the darkening sky, where the clouds were turning the color of bruised iron. "I can manage the walk to King Street without assistance," she replied, turning her face back to him. Gideon did not press or move from his position against the iron railing. "My carriage is waiting at the corner of the next block, and I can take you to your door without any need for conversation, if that is what you prefer. I simply find it a waste to watch a woman with more intelligence than the entire ballroom walk into a summer downpour because of pride." "You were in the ballroom tonight?" Maeve asked, her voice dropping a fraction as she looked at him. "I was there," Gideon answered, his expression remaining perfectly still under his white hair. "I saw the way you stood for 3 seconds, looked at the ring and decided that staying would cost you more than leaving." There was no pity in his voice, only the flat statement of a fact she could not deny. Maeve thought of her father, Thomas Jenkins, who used to tell her that refusing a useful tool just to prove a point was the foolish behavior of a proud mind. "Where is your carriage, Mr. Cross?" she asked, letting her hands fall to her sides as the first heavy drop of rain struck her shoulder. The carriage waiting at the corner was completely black, lacking the bright paint or family insignias common among the wealthy merchants of the city. Two large black horses stood before it, completely motionless through the rising wind, their dark coats gleaming under the street lamps. Gideon opened the door for her, his pale hand steady against the wood, and Maeve climbed inside without waiting for him to offer further explanations. The air inside the carriage was instantly cool, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the Charleston streets outside. She sat back against the dark leather seat, folding her hands in her lap, as Gideon climbed in opposite her and closed the door. The carriage began to move immediately, the wheels turning smoothly as the rain began to hit the roof in earnest. "You may say whatever you are thinking about the events at the mansion," Maeve said, looking across at the white-haired man through the dim interior. "I had no intention of speaking about your personal affairs," Gideon replied, his gray eyes fixed on her face. "Most people feel a strong need to offer sympathy or commentary when they witness a public rejection," she noted. "I am not most people, Miss Jenkins," he said, his pale features remaining unreadable in the shadows. "You knew my name before you stopped me on the street tonight," she said. "I make it a habit to know the names of individuals who understand how to manage difficult situations." Gideon answered, his voice smooth and level. He looked out the small window for a brief second before turning his attention back to her. "Your father was Thomas Jenkins, the shipping merchant, who passed away 2 years ago and left his entire estate to you instead of his male cousins. You settled every single debt and closed the business without entering a courtroom, which is something most men with 40 years of experience cannot achieve." Maeve felt a cold prickle of curiosity replace her anger. "You have made a thorough study of my family history, Mr. Cross." "I study anyone I intend to do business with," he stated, his pale hands resting calmly on his knees. "I am no longer in the shipping trade," she said. "Not at present, but you understand the mechanics of contracts better than my current managers," Gideon explained. "I operate 3 separate offices along the northern coast, and my directors are excellent with numbers, but completely blind to the intentions of the people they deal with. I have lost 2 significant trade agreements this year because my staff cannot read a room before signing a document. You read that ballroom tonight perfectly. Choosing the exact moment to walk away when staying would have ruined your position. I am offering you a position to review my northern contracts, reporting directly to me with a salary equal to my top director." Maeve looked at the strange white-haired man as the rain hammered the carriage roof, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a door open. Maeve sat in the silence of the moving carriage, the cool air carrying a faint scent of pine and rain-washed stone that seemed to belong to a completely different climate. She studied Gideon Cross, noting that his breath did not mist against the cold glass of the window, and his white skin seemed completely unaffected by the dampness of the night. "If I accept this position, Mr. Cross, I will require the terms to be delivered in writing before tomorrow evening," she stated, her voice cutting through the steady sound of the storm outside. "I expect full access to the original trade agreements, and my findings will go directly to you without any interference from your office directors." Gideon nodded once, a brief and sharp movement that signaled his agreement without the need for unnecessary negotiation. "Every term will be documented precisely as you have stated, and you will answer to no one but me during your time in my employ," he replied, his low voice carrying a weight that made her believe him. The carriage slowed to a smooth halt in front of her small house on King Street, the yellow light from her porch lamp reflecting off the wet pavement. Before she could reach for the brass door handle, Gideon spoke again, his gray eyes fixed on her. "Charles Higgins acted like a fool tonight," he said quietly. "Fools always discover their mistakes when it is far too late to fix them. My father always told me that the worst mistake a man can make is to assume a woman has reached her limit, when she is simply being patient," Maeve said, turning her face to look at him one last time. She pushed the carriage door open, stepped into the pouring rain, and walked up her porch steps, without waiting to see his reaction. Inside her quiet hallway, she did not shed a single tear or allow herself to pace the floor in anger. She walked straight to her father's old walnut writing desk, where his commercial ledgers were still stacked neatly in the corner. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper from the drawer, dipped her steel pen into the black ink, and wrote Gideon's name at the very top of the blank page. She recorded every detail of their conversation under his name, listing the northern offices, the salary terms, and the specific conditions she had demanded inside the carriage. Her father had trained her to record facts, first analyze the situation second, and make her final decision only when the emotional weight of an event had settled. Below the terms, she wrote a single sentence to guide her choices over the coming days. Make sure this path is a door to something new, not just a window to watch the past. She stared at the wet ink for 10 minutes, watching the rain wash the dust from the street outside her window, until the cobblestones gleamed like glass under the lamps. She sent her formal acceptance letter on Thursday morning, keeping the message down to 7 short lines that confirmed her arrival at his Charleston office on Monday morning at 8 o'clock. She did not include any mention of the rain, the carriage ride, or the family she had left behind in the Higgins ballroom. His response arrived at her house 3 hours later, containing 4 lines that simply confirmed the time and directed her to ask for the head clerk upon her arrival. The brevity of his note gave her a sense of comfort that she had not felt in months, indicating a professional boundary that suited her current state of mind. She spent the remainder of the weekend reviewing her father's old liquidation records to sharpen her mind for the tasks ahead. She arrived at the offices of Cross Trading at 15 minutes before 8 o'clock on Monday morning, wearing a plain gray walking dress that lacked any ornament. The main clerk sat behind a high mahogany counter, his eyes fixed on a large ledger, as he dipped his pen into ink with mechanical regularity. "I am Maeve Jenkins, and I have an appointment with Mr. Cross for the morning session," she said, standing directly before his desk. The clerk looked up, his expression neutral, until she mentioned the owner's name, causing him to recalculate his posture within 2 seconds. "Mr. Cross is expecting you in the rear office, but you will need to speak with the director first," he said, pointing toward a heavy oak door at the end of the hall. Maeve stood by the large window in the hallway, while she waited, observing the movement of the clerks and the crates of trade goods being tracked in the courtyard below. The office was filled with the scent of dried tobacco, printed ink, and old paper, creating an atmosphere of intense commercial activity that felt grounded and real. A door opened at the far end of the corridor, and a man walked out who shared none of Gideon's quiet composure. He was 45 years old, with a red face and a thick beard that showed signs of neglect, moving with the hurried irritation of someone who disliked being delayed. He looked at Maeve with a sharp assessment that told her exactly what he thought of a woman entering his workspace. "I am Gerald Burke, the director of this location," the man said, his voice loud and slightly raspy, as he stopped 3 feet away from her. "Mr. Cross informed me of your presence, and I have prepared a desk for you in the back correspondence room where you can check the general logs. You will flag any simple accounting mistakes and hand your notes to me at the end of each afternoon session." Maeve looked into his red face, recognizing the familiar attempt to place her in a position where she could cause no trouble for his established routine. "That is not the arrangement I made with Mr. Cross," she stated, her voice clear enough to carry down the quiet hallway. Gerald Burke blinked at her words, his red face turning a darker shade as he adjusted his wool coat. "I manage the day-to-day operations of this entire office, Miss Jenkins, and all reports must clear my desk before they are sent to the owner," he said, his voice tightening with anger. "The written terms of my employment state that my accountability runs directly to Mr. Cross without any intermediaries," Maeve replied, keeping her expression perfectly level. "I intend to honor that agreement to the letter, and I expect this office to provide the same level of professional courtesy." Burke stared at her for several seconds, his jaw working silently, before he pointed toward a small room near the back stairs, and walked away without another word. Maeve picked up her small leather bag, walked into the correspondence room, and began her first day of real work. The Northern contracts were stacked in 3 wooden crates beneath a small desk that looked out onto the gray stone courtyard. She spent the next 4 hours organizing the documents by date, looking past the surface numbers to find the actual history of the transactions. By the middle of the afternoon session, she noticed a distinct irregularity in the agreements made with a merchant named Walter Boyd. Over the past 18 months, the payment schedules for Boyd's shipping routes had been modified during the peak winter months in a way that reduced the company's profits by 20%. She pulled the original agreements from the bottom of the crate and laid them side by side with the revised versions on her desk. Someone had approved these changes without adding the necessary signatures from the primary office, leaving only a single name at the bottom of the page. Maeve leaned back in her chair, her mind moving through the implications of the discovery as she heard a soft knock on the open door frame. A young clerk with ink stains on his fingers stood in the doorway, holding a stack of fresh paper. "I am Robert Reed, the assistant for the Northern files," he said quietly, looking at her desk with a cautious expression. "Come in." "Mr. Reed," Maeve said, turning the 2 contracts so he could see the signatures at the bottom of the paper. "Can you tell me who authorized these specific changes for the winter routes?" "With Walter Boyd." Robert Reed looked at the documents, his face turning pale as he stepped further into the small room and glanced back toward the hallway. Mr. Burke handled those negotiations during his private trips to the northern ports. "Last winter," the young man whispered, his hands tightening around his papers. "I am not supposed to discuss the director's private accounts with anyone outside his office. You have answered my question sufficiently. Mr. Reed and I appreciate your assistance with these files," Maeve said, offering him a brief nod of reassurance. The young clerk left the room quickly, leaving her alone with the evidence she had gathered in less than 6 hours of concentrated study. She spent the next 2 hours drafting a 3-page summary of her findings, focusing entirely on the dates, the signature lines, and the specific loss of revenue. She was sealing the document with red wax when the door opened and Gideon Cross entered the room, his white hair catching the faint light of the late afternoon. He looked at the neat rows of contracts on her desk, the open ledger, and the sealed envelope she held in her hand. "You were directed to begin with the general flagging list." Gideon noted his pale face, showing no sign of surprise, as he stopped near her chair. The general list was insufficient, because it treated every irregularity as a simple mistake rather than a conscious choice. Maeve explained, passing the sealed summary across the wood. "Mr. Burke approved these contract modifications without your signature, resulting in a significant loss for cross-trading over the past 18 months. Gideon took the paper, broke the wax with his pale thumb, and read the pages in absolute silence. Maeve watched his gray eyes move across her handwriting, noting that his expression did not alter by a fraction as he processed the information. He set the 3 pages down on the corner of the desk, his white skin looking stark against the dark mahogany wood. "You discovered this pattern during your first afternoon session," he noted, his low voice dropping to a level that made the room feel smaller. "The pattern was not difficult to find once I matched the delivery dates against the actual bank deposits," Maeve answered, looking up at him without blinking. "Gerald Burke has managed this specific location for 9 years, and he has a private relationship with Walter Boyd that extends beyond these files. I am aware of his association with Boyd," Gideon said, his white hair reflecting the shadows of the room as the sun began to set behind the brick walls of the courtyard. "I needed someone who could document the connection with enough precision to satisfy our legal counsel before I made a move to remove him. You will need the original shipping manifests from the director's private office to confirm the exact delivery dates against the altered payment sheets," Maeve stated. her tone entirely businesslike. "I will have those documents on your desk before 8 o'clock tomorrow morning," Gideon replied, picking up her summary and turning toward the door. She was gathering her cloak from the back of the chair when Gerald Burke appeared in the doorway, his red face damp with sweat as he blocked her exit. "You have been very busy today, Miss Jenkins, but you must understand that this business relies on long-term relationships that cannot be understood in a single afternoon," he said, his voice containing a low warning. "I understand that contracts must be honored as they are written," Mr. Burke Maeve replied, stepping forward until she was inches away from him. "If your private relationships have resulted in terms that cost this company money, you will need to explain that choice to Mr. Cross, with full documentation." She walked past him into the street, the cool evening air clearing her head after the long hours inside the small room. Her hands were steady as she locked her front door on King Street and prepared a simple dinner for herself in her quiet kitchen. She spent the evening reading her father's old business journals, drawing strength from his familiar handwriting and his steady advice regarding difficult men. On Tuesday morning, she found the private shipping manifests waiting on her desk exactly as Gideon had promised, their leather covers cool to her touch. She went to work immediately, building the final chain of evidence that would prove the director's fraud beyond any doubt. By the middle of the morning session, Robert Reed appeared in her doorway again, his expression full of anxiety as he held a small silver tray. "There is a gentleman in the outer office who insists on speaking with you regarding a personal matter," the young clerk said, his voice shaking slightly. "He gave his name as Charles Higgins, and he refuses to leave until you grant him an interview." Maeve set her steel pen down on the desk, her fingers flat against the white paper as she took a deep breath. "Tell Mr. Higgins that I am currently engaged with the company's accounts and cannot receive visitors during business hours," she said clearly. Before Robert Reed could leave the room, Charles Higgins stepped past him into the office, his expensive wool coat looking out of place among the wooden crates and paper stacks. "Maeve, please give me 5 minutes of your time to explain what occurred at the ballroom," he said, his handsome face full of an expression that looked like regret. "Leave us, Mr. Reed," Maeve said, keeping her eyes fixed on Charles until the young clerk closed the door behind him. "This is a place of business, Mr. Higgins, and your presence here is entirely inappropriate given our current lack of any social connection. Maeve, the arrangement with Lily Thornton was my father's decision to settle our family's commercial debts with her father, Charles," said, taking a step toward her desk with his hands extended. "I never intended for you to discover the matter in such a public fashion, and I wanted to explain the necessity of the match before the news became common knowledge. You let me believe for 2 years that our future was secure while you were negotiating a marriage contract with another family," Maeve said, her voice dropping to a level that made him stop moving. "You treated me as a temporary convenience while you waited for a better financial offer to appear. It was not a choice I made gladly." Charles muttered, his eyes dropping to the contracts spread across her desk. "You look different today, Maeve. There is a coldness in your manner that I have never seen before. The woman you knew spent 2 years being patient, while you hid your true intentions behind easy promises," she answered, her voice completely devoid of emotion. "I am no longer that woman, and I have no desire to hear your explanations or your regrets. Goodbye, Charles." He stood in the silence of the room for several seconds, realizing that his words had no power to move her before he turned and walked out of the building. Maeve picked up her pen and went back to the shipping manifests, her hand remaining perfectly steady as she recorded the next line of figures in her ledger. By Thursday afternoon, she had completed her second summary, a dense document that connected Gerald Burke's signatures to specific bank deposits made by Walter Boyd. Gideon Cross entered her room at 6 o'clock, his pale features illuminated by the lamp on her desk as he took the completed file from her hands. This is enough to terminate Burke's employment and initiate formal legal proceedings against his partners. Gideon stated, his gray eyes fixed on her face. Charles Higgins came to this office on Tuesday morning. He noted his white hair catching the shadow of the window frame as he spoke. He did, and I told him goodbye permanently. Maeve answered, looking up at him, without any hesitation in her gaze. Gideon nodded, once his pale expression softening slightly, in a way that made the room feel less cold. "Good," he said simply. "You possess a rare mind, Miss Jenkins, and I am starting to realize that my choice to stop my carriage on that rainy night was the best decision I have made in 40 years. Maeve watched him leave, feeling a quiet sense of purpose settle in her chest as she closed her books for the evening. The formal inquiry into Gerald Burke's accounts began on Monday morning in the main conference room near the front entrance of Cross Trading. Maeve remained at her desk in the back correspondence room, focusing her attention on the Southern Port files to keep her mind from drifting to the events down the hall. The atmosphere in the office had changed completely over the weekend, with the other clerks moving silently through the corridors and treating her with a quiet respect that had been missing during her first week. The clerk at the front counter now bowed his head slightly whenever she passed, acknowledging her role in uncovering the director's fraud. At 11 o'clock, Arthur Sims, the senior legal counsel for the company, entered her room holding a thick leather case under his arm. He was an older man with gray hair and sharp eyes that had spent 40 years looking for lies in commercial contracts. "Miss Jenkins, Mr. Cross asked me to review the signature timeline on page 2 of your summary," he said, taking a chair across from her desk. "You have documented 4 separate instances where Burke signed these modifications without the necessary oversight from the main office. Yes, and each instance matches a specific delivery that arrived 2 weeks late, without any penalty being applied to Walter Boyd's firm," Maeve explained, opening her ledger to show him the corresponding dates. Arthur Sims studied the pages for several minutes, his mouth tightening into a thin line as he verified the numbers against his own notes. "Your father was Thomas Jenkins, the shipping merchant who managed the harbor accounts during the war," he noted, looking up at her over his spectacles. "I knew him peripherally, and he was known for his absolute precision when dealing with complex agreements. I see he passed that trait down to his daughter. I learned to read every line of a contract because people often assume a woman will not take the time to verify the details," Maeve answered quietly. Sims packed his papers back into his leather case and stood up, offering her a formal bow before he moved toward the door. "Your summary will be the central piece of evidence when we present this case to the Merchants Association next month," he stated. "Gerald Burke has already confessed to receiving private payments from Boyd, but he insists he was acting under instructions from a more powerful individual in the city." Maeve felt a sudden chill return to the room as Gideon Cross entered from the hallway, his white hair and pale skin looking completely unchanging despite the long hours of the inquiry. Errors are random occurrences, but decisions always leave a clear path to follow, Gideon said, repeating the words she had written in her first report. "You found the path because you looked past the simple numbers to find the intent behind them." Arthur Sims left the room, leaving the two of them alone in the dimming light of the afternoon session. Maeve looked at Gideon, noticing that his pale face seemed closer now, the distance between them shrinking with every report she delivered to his desk. On Wednesday afternoon, her work was interrupted by a visitor who arrived in an elegant carriage that stopped directly in front of the building. A woman stepped out of the carriage and walked into the correspondence room, her expensive silk dress and composed manner showing her high status among Charleston's elite families. "I am Ellen Gable, and I believe you have been reviewing the contracts related to my husband's shipping firm," she said, stopping before Maeve's desk without an introduction. "My husband was a minor partner in the Northern Routes, and he was forced to accept Gerald Burke's terms because of pressure from Arthur Thornton." Maeve remained in her seat, her eyes fixed on the woman's face, as she processed the name of Lily Thornton's father. Arthur Thornton is the primary banker for the Higgins family, and he controls half the commercial loans in this city, Maeve noted, keeping her voice level. Why are you bringing this information to me instead of going to the legal counsel or the authorities? Because my husband is about to take the full blame for a fraud that was designed by Thornton to drain funds from cross-trading. Ellen Gable answered, producing a bundle of private letters from her silk bag. These documents contain the explicit instructions Thornton sent to Burke over the past 18 months, proving his involvement in the contract modifications. Maeve took the letters, her fingers tracking the familiar signature of the man who had just brokered the marriage between his daughter and Charles Higgins. If I hand these papers to Mr. Cross, your husband will still face legal consequences for his participation in the scheme, she warned. My husband will accept his share of the responsibility, but I will not allow Arthur Thornton to remain silent while smaller men are ruined by his choices, Ellen Gable stated, her jaw tightening with determination. She turned and left the room, her silk dress rustling against the stone floor as she returned to her carriage. Maeve spent the next 3 hours drafting her third summary incorporating Thornton's private letters into the existing timeline of the fraud. She did not allow her personal history with the Higgins family to alter the flat professional language of her report, keeping the focus entirely on the verifiable facts. She walked into Gideon's private office at 7 o'clock and placed the new file on his desk, waiting while he read through the letters in the quiet room. This connects the fraud directly to the family that broke your engagement 3 weeks ago. Gideon noted, his gray eyes fixed on her face under his white hair. The evidence speaks for itself, regardless of my personal history with the individuals involved. Maeve answered, looking at his pale features without any hesitation. Arthur Thornton will use his considerable influence within the Merchants Association to suppress these findings if he discovers we have his signature. He will try to destroy your position in this city because you found the truth. Gideon said, his low voice carrying a strange resonance that made the room feel cold. He stood up from his chair, his tall figure moving with that absolute stillness that she was beginning to understand was not human. I must tell you the truth about my business and my presence in this city. Miss Jenkins, Gideon said, his white skin catching the moonlight from the window as he stood before her. My white hair, my pale skin, and the coldness you feel in my presence are not the result of an illness or a foreign origin. I am the Vampire King, and my family has controlled the hidden trade routes along this coast for over 2 centuries, protecting this city's commerce from the shadows, while human merchants play their petty games for wealth. Maeve looked at him, her mind processing his words with the same analytical clarity she used for her contracts. She did not scream or run from the room because the facts of her time in his office aligned perfectly with his revelation. His cold temperature, his lack of breath, his absolute stillness, and the strange respect he showed for her mind were more real than any human promises she had received from Charles Higgins. You stopped your carriage on that rainy night because you needed someone who could find the fraud without being influenced by the human relationships in this city, she noted, her voice remaining steady. I stopped because I had been watching your father's work for 40 years, and I knew his daughter possessed the only mind capable of cleaning my offices. Gideon answered honestly. I accepted your offer because the door was open, and I have never been afraid of what lies behind a clean decision, Maeve said, offering him her hand across the dark wood of his desk. His fingers were cold as ice when they closed around hers, but his grip was firm and steady, providing a sense of security that she had not felt since her father's passing. We will present these findings to the Merchants Association on the 3rd Thursday of September, Gideon stated, releasing her hand with a slow nod. Arthur Thornton will be present along with Richard Higgins, and they will discover that their signatures have destroyed their positions. Maeve spent the next 3 weeks preparing for the presentation, working late into the night, until the small correspondence room was filled with the neat stacks of verified evidence. Her cousin Anna came to visit her on the Wednesday before the meeting, sitting across her small parlor table on King Street with a concerned expression. "You have changed since you began working for cross-trading Maeve. Your eyes look like they have seen something older than this town," Anna noted, sipping her tea. "Something was burned away in that ballroom, and I have found a place where my mind is valued for what it can achieve," Maeve answered, turning a page in her ledger. "There are rumors in the city that Charles Higgins is miserable with his new match, and his father is scrambling to secure loans from the northern banks," Anna said quietly. "Misery is the natural consequence of making choices based entirely on appearance and greed," Maeve replied, closing her book with a firm snap. "I have no time to think about their misery because I have a meeting to attend on State Street tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. She went to bed early that night, her sleep deep and undisturbed by any dreams of the past, as the cool September wind began to stir the trees outside her bedroom window. The 12 members of the Charleston Merchants Association sat around a long oak table in the council hall, the air thick with tobacco smoke and the quiet confidence of wealthy men. Maeve walked into the room at 9 o'clock beside Arthur Sims, her black leather case held firmly in her hand as she took her place at the presentation desk. Gideon Cross stood against the back wall under his white hair, his pale features remaining perfectly still, as Richard Higgins and several other prominent merchants watched him with expressions of nervous curiosity. Maeve arranged her papers with mechanical precision, ignoring the whispered comments from the older men at the far end of the table. "Gentlemen, in the spring of 1815, a series of deliberate choices was made to alter the shipping contracts of cross-trading for private financial gain." Maeve began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room. She did not offer any opening pleasantries or soft introductions, moving straight to the first contract modification signed by Gerald Burke. For 40 minutes, she walked the council through the dates, the diverted bank deposits, and the private letters written by Arthur Thornton, building an airtight chain of evidence that left no room for denial. Richard Higgins sat with his hands flat on the table, his face turning pale as she read the letters aloud. "This evidence is based on documents produced by individuals who are themselves implicated in these proceedings," a younger merchant noted from the center of the table, his tone aggressive as he tried to defend Thornton's interests. "The transaction logs from the Providence exchange match the specific account numbers listed in these letters?" "Exactly," Maeve answered immediately, looking at him until he leaned back in his seat. "This is not a question of credibility. It is a matter of documented verification that cannot be altered by personal influence." The chairman of the council looked at Gideon Cross, who had not spoken a single word during the entire session. "Do you stand behind these findings, Mr. Cross?" The chairman asked, his voice full of the gravity of the situation. "Completely," Gideon answered, his 2 words cutting through the room with a weight that made several merchants shift uncomfortably in their chairs. The council called a brief recess at 10 o'clock, and Gideon crossed the room to sit in the empty chair beside Maeve's table. "You demonstrated an extraordinary level of nerve in that room, Miss Jenkins," he said quietly, his gray eyes fixed on her face. "I delivered the facts exactly as they were written in your ledgers, and accuracy requires no apology," she answered, looking at his white skin. The second session lasted only 20 minutes, as the remaining members of the council realized that the evidence against Thornton and Higgins was too solid to be overturned by political maneuvering. When the meeting was formally adjourned, several older merchants stopped by her desk to offer their professional respects, acknowledging her father's legacy and her own precision. Richard Higgins left the hall without looking in her direction, his posture looking broken as he walked out into the cool September afternoon. Maeve packed her documents back into her leather case, feeling the weight of the past 2 years finally lift from her shoulders as she walked toward the door where Gideon was waiting. They walked together down the stone steps of the council hall, the cool breeze from the harbor carrying the first hint of autumn as they moved along the pavement. "I am restructuring our northern operations, and I want you to go to our main office as the director of northern accounts," Gideon said, his low voice regular and certain as they turned the corner. "The title can be whatever suits the work, but I need the only person I trust completely to hold the line against those merchants. I accept the position under the same terms we established during our first carriage ride," Maeve answered, looking up at his pale face under his white hair. "There is another matter that requires your consideration, Miss Jenkins." Gideon continued, stopping near the quiet iron gates of a small garden. "I am not a man who moves quickly toward personal arrangements, but I have been paying attention to you since before the storm on King Street. Once your position in our northern offices is fully established on its own professional merits, I would like to know if you might be willing to consider an association that extends beyond our business contracts." Maeve looked into his gray eyes, recognizing the absolute honesty of his request, and the total absence of the manufactured charm she had experienced with Charles Higgins. "I would be willing to consider such an arrangement." "Mr. Cross?" she replied, her voice steady and true, as she took the arm he offered her. They walked back toward the office through the clean afternoon light, their steps matching perfectly as they discussed the upcoming changes to the shipping logs. 2 months later, the legal proceedings concluded with the complete removal of Gerald Burke from commercial practice and the restructuring of Arthur Thornton's banking house under court supervision. Charles Higgins left Charleston for an extended stay in the Northern Territories, his family's influence in the shipping trade completely finished. Maeve sat at her new desk in the Northern office on a quiet Thursday evening in November, a small fire crackling in the hearth, as the sound of the harbor came through the window. She pulled her father's old walnut ledger toward her, opening the last page to look at the notes she had written on the night her engagement had ended. Below her old handwriting, she dipped her pen into the black ink and added one final line to the record. He was right. The path was a door to a life that is entirely my own. She closed the ledger and placed it in the drawer, ready for the morning session and the future she had built with her own steady hands. Sitting in the quiet office with the letters from Gideon stacked neatly beside her lamp, she looked out at the dark water of the harbor, where the ships were preparing for their winter voyages. The choices she had made over the past months felt like solid stones beneath her feet, providing a foundation that did not depend on the whims or promises of men who only valued convenience. She understood now that her father's lessons had not been about managing lines in an old book. They were about maintaining her own worth when the world around her attempted to reduce her value. The future stretched out before her like an open sea full of cold winds and unknown ports, but she felt no fear of the dark water or the strange paths ahead. She had found a partner who saw her mind with perfect clarity, and she had discovered that the strength to walk away from a lie was the only key she needed to unlock her own truth. That was the whole of it, and that was enough.